Ethan Cole was underneath a rusted pickup when the black subs rolled into the cracked parking lot of Cole Auto Works. He heard them before he saw them, 3 expensive engines purring too smoothly for a street where most cars came to die quietly. His 9-year-old son, Noah, sat on an overturned milk crate near the office door, rolling a small blue toy race car across his knee while the old radio played low behind him. The garage smelled of oil, dust, warm rubber, and the cheap coffee Ethan had forgotten on the workbench. Above the open bay door, the sign that carried his last name had lost half its paint. But Ethan had never taken it down. It had been there when he rented the place after Emily got sick. It had been there when he buried her 3 years later. And on bad mornings, when bills stacked up and customers asked for credit, it was still the first thing Noah saw when he looked up at his father. The first SUV stopped so close to the bay entrance that its polished black bumper reflected the garage like an insult. A woman stepped out in a cream-colored coat, high heels clicking against broken asphalt, as if the ground had no right to be uneven beneath her. 2 men with tablets followed her. Behind them came a city inspector, a photographer, and a small cluster of investors who looked at Cole Auto Works the way people looked at a building already marked for demolition. The woman was Lena Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Auto Group, and the project she was showing these investors was supposed to make her chairwoman before the end of the year. A $12 million luxury electric showroom would rise on this block if every old structure disappeared on schedule. Ethan slid out from under the pickup, wiped his hands on a rag, and stood. For a moment, he did not recognize her. Then she took off her sunglasses, tilted her head, and smiled like she had found an old joke still waiting where she left it. "Ethan Cole," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I thought this town finally threw you away." No, stopped moving the toy car. Ethan did not answer right away. He looked at Lena's face and saw 22 years fold into one sharp image. Falcon Ridge High, senior hallway, Lena Whitmore laughing with her friends near the trophy case, her voice following him like gum stuck to a shoe. Shop rat, cheater, garage trash. Back then, her father owned half the town and donated enough money to the school that people listened when the Whitmores whispered. Now Lena stood in front of his garage with a CEO-esque confidence. A development folder in one hand, and the same old cruelty polished until it looked like success. Lena glanced at Noah, then at the pickup, then at the faded sign above the bay. "You brought your child to work in this?" she asked. "That is almost impressive." Most men at least try to hide failure from their sons. A few people behind her gave the kind of uncomfortable laugh people offered powerful people when they were not sure whether silence was safe. Noah's fingers closed around the blue toy car until his knuckles paled. Ethan saw it, and that was the only reason his voice stayed calm. "Can I help you, Lena?" Her smile sharpened when he used her first name, as if she had wanted him to remember. "You can clear out," she said, lifting the folder. Whitmore Auto Group finalized the development transfer this morning. This block is being converted into a luxury electric showroom and service center. My investors want progress. The board wants progress. And this garage, Ethan, is not progress. It is a worthless little cave for a man who never became anything. The words moved through the garage and landed exactly where she aimed them. Not on Ethan, but on Noah. The boy looked down, pretending to study the toy car, but Ethan saw the red rise in his ears. One of the investors whispered something to another man. The photographer lifted his camera, then lowered it when Ethan looked his way. Lena stepped farther into the bay and ran one finger across the dusty hood of the pickup. "Still fixing other people's junk," she said, "still smelling like the auto shop hallway. Some things never change." Ethan did not move toward her. He had learned long ago that some people wanted anger because anger made them feel right. Instead, he stepped slightly sideways, placing himself between Lena and Noah without making it obvious. "This garage has an active lease," he said. "If you have paperwork, you can leave it on the counter." "Oh, I have paperwork." Lena turned and signaled one of her assistants. "You have 72 hours to remove tools, vehicles, personal property, hazardous materials, and anything else slowing demolition. After that, the site becomes restricted. If you interfere, we involve legal. If this shop fails inspection, we involve licensing." She paused, looking around with theatrical disgust. And judging by the smell, that part should not be difficult. Noah stood up, still clutching the toy car. "Dad," he whispered, "are they taking the garage?" The question changed the air. Ethan turned toward him, but before he could answer, Lena laughed softly. "Your father should have learned this lesson in high school," she said. "You cannot build a future out of scrap." That was when Ethan saw it. Not Lena's coat, not the folder, not the investors pretending not to enjoy the scene. His eyes moved past her shoulder to the back wall, where a row of old metal lockers stood half hidden behind stacked tires and warped plywood. Ethan had painted over them years ago because they were rusted shut and ugly, and because old-school lockers in an old garage felt like somebody else's memories. But one patch of paint had peeled during the summer heat. Beneath it, a number showed through in dull white. 17. Lena's gaze flicked toward it for less than a second, then back to Ethan. It was quick, almost nothing, but Ethan had spent his life reading what people tried not to show. Before we go further, if you have ever been judged by an old rumor, a cheap shirt, a tired face, or a place people called worthless, stay with this story. Tell us where you are listening from. And remember this. Sometimes the past does not disappear. Sometimes it waits quietly in the one room powerful people forgot to empty. Lena gave the garage one more slow look, the kind meant to reduce everything inside it to dirt. "My team will return tomorrow with security," she said. "Do not make this embarrassing." Ethan almost smiled at that. "You brought investors to a mechanic's garage, so you could call it worthless in front of his child," he said. "I think embarrassing already arrived." For the first time, Lena's expression tightened. It was not much, but Riley Shaw saw it. Riley was the youngest person in Lena's development team. A woman with a neat blazer, tired eyes, and a tablet held against her chest like a shield. She had spent the morning arranging site photos and permit notes for the showroom presentation. She had not expected the CEO to know the mechanic by name. She had not expected the little boy. And she had not expected Lena Whitmore, who could charm a boardroom in 6 minutes, to look suddenly nervous at a row of painted-over lockers. Lena turned sharply. "Riley, photograph the exterior, not the interior. We do not need sentimental clutter in the investor deck." Then she looked back at Ethan. 72 hours, shop rat. The old name hit the garage harder than the legal notice. Noah looked up. Ethan saw the question form before the boy asked it. "Why did she call you that? Why did she know you? Why did everyone look away when she said it?" Ethan had spent years protecting Noah from bills, from grief, from the empty side of the dinner table where Emily used to sit. But there were some wounds children found because other adults pointed at them. The Suvs left in the same smooth line in which they had arrived. Dust settled behind them, for several seconds. The only sound in the garage was the small metallic ticking of the pickup cooling in the bay. Noah walked to Ethan and held out the blue toy car. "Mom said this place was ours," he said quietly. Ethan crouched until their eyes were level. "She said it was where we kept going," he answered. "That is different, but it matters more." "Was she your friend?" Noah asked. "Who the lady?" Ethan looked toward the road where Lena Suvs had disappeared. "No," he said. "She was someone I knew when I was young." "Why did she call you shop rat?" Ethan took a breath. In the corner, sunlight slipped across the back wall and caught the chipped number on locker 17. "Because some people give you a name when they want everyone to stop asking who you really are," he said. Noah did not understand all of it, but he understood enough to look hurt. He placed the toy car on Ethan's palm. It was a small blue racer with worn wheels and a scratch down one side. Emily had bought it at a flea market when Noah was 4, back when she still had enough strength to walk slowly through outdoor stalls on Sunday mornings. She used to tell Noah that old things were not sad just because they were chipped. Old things had survived more hands. That evening, Ethan closed the garage early, not because the work was done, but because the silence had grown too heavy around the bay. He made Noah grilled cheese in the small room behind the office, where they kept a microwave, a fold-out cot, and boxes of unpaid invoices he pretended were organized. Noah ate half his sandwich and stared at the wall, through the thin glass window. The lockers stood in the shadows like a row of people refusing to speak. "Dad," Noah said, "are people at school going to know?" Ethan wanted to say no, but Lena had brought a photographer and investors. And in a town like Falcon Ridge, bad news traveled faster than kindness. "Maybe," he said. Noah nodded like a boy trying to behave older than 9. "Jace Whitmore is in my class. He says his mom owns everything with wheels." Ethan looked up from the skillet. "Does he bother you?" "No." No pushed a crumb around his plate. "Not a lot." That meant yes. Ethan knew because he had once been a boy in that same town. learning how to make pain sound smaller so adults would not worry. He sat across from Noah and rested his hands flat on the table. Listen to me. This garage is not worthless because somebody with more money says it is. Your mother used to say old places remember what people try to bury. Noah looked toward the bay. What did this place bury? Ethan almost told him nothing. It would have been easier. But another glance at locker 17 stopped the lie in his throat. I didn't know yet, he said, but I think someone is afraid we might find out. The next morning, the humiliation followed. Noah before the legal notice reached Ethan. At school drop-off, Noah climbed out of the truck with his backpack hanging from one shoulder and the blue toy car tucked in his pocket. Jace Whitmore stood near the fence with two boys from class, grinning like he had borrowed his mother's mouth. My mom says your dad's garage is getting bulldozed, Jace said. She said it smells like loser oil. One of the boys laughed. Noah did not answer. He looked back at Ethan's truck, but Ethan had already pulled away because he did not know the world had reached his son that fast. Noah carried that sentence all morning. He did not tell his teacher. He did not cry. He only kept one hand in his pocket around the toy car until the plastic wheels pressed marks into his palm. By the time a neighbor brought him back to Cole Auto Works after school, he had learned what Ethan had learned as a boy. Sometimes a rumor did not have to be true to make a room treat you differently. After Noah fell asleep on the fold-out cot that night, Ethan went back into the garage with a flashlight, his phone, and the patience of a man who knew discovery without proof could become another accusation. He did not touch the locker at first. He photographed the row from a distance, then each lock, each hinge, each place where paint had peeled. He photographed the number 17, the chipped white paint beneath the newer gray, and the dusty floor in front of it. He even photographed the old wall clock above the tool cabinet. Because time mattered, he had learned that lesson the hard way. A truth without a date could be made to look like a story. The lock on locker 17 was old, brass darkened, almost black, but not broken. Ethan knelt in front of it and studied the scratches around the hasp. Somebody had tried to open it before. Years ago or months ago, he could not tell under the dust. He took another picture. Then he heard Emily's voice in memory, soft from the hospital bed but still stubborn. Do not rush, just because they want you scared. People who rush leave their fingerprints on other people's lies. He stood and backed away from the locker. No tools, no pry bar, no broken lock, not yet. By morning, the threat became official. A white envelope was taped to the garage door when Ethan arrived from taking Noah to school. Inside was a notice from Whitmore Development Services stating that the property had been included in a transfer package connected to the old Falcon Ridge vocational block. The letter claimed Ethan's lease was subject to early termination for redevelopment and possible safety violations. Attached was a checklist: chemical storage, outdated electrical, unregistered vehicles, fire hazards, environmental review. None of it was a direct accusation. It was worse. It was a net. At 10:20, a city inspector named Paul Danner arrived with a clipboard and an apology already written on his face. Ethan, I have to take a look, he said. Complaint came through this morning. What kind of complaint? Paul looked uncomfortable. Hazardous storage, unsafe structure, possible unlicensed work. Ethan looked around at the garage he had swept every night for 5 years because Noah sometimes played on that floor. You know my license is current. I know, Paul said, but the complaint names the property. Not just you. If I don't file the inspection, they'll send someone from county. He lowered his voice and Ethan they asked about the back wall. Specific area, lockers, storage. Old school fixtures, there it was again. Locker 17. Ethan let Paul inspect. He opened cabinets, showed labeled containers, receipts for disposal, fire extinguisher tags, service records, and his business license in a plastic sleeve. He answered every question calmly. By noon, Paul had found minor issues but nothing that justified closure. Still, he wrote a temporary compliance notice because paperwork had a way of serving whoever paid lawyers to read it louder. While Paul was leaving, Riley Shaw pulled into the lot in a company sedan. She looked younger without Lena beside her, less certain, more human. She held a folder and did not step past the bay line. Mr. Cole? Ethan closed the hood of the pickup. If Lena sent you to photograph the inside. The answer is no. She sent me to confirm you received the notice. Riley glanced toward the lockers, then quickly away. And to remind you that removing company property from the site could be considered interference. My tools are company property now. That is not what I said. No, Ethan replied. That is what the letter is built to become. Ree swallowed. Her eyes moved to the back wall again. Can I ask you something? Did you go to Falcon Ridge High? Ethan wiped his hands slowly. Lena already answered that for everyone. I found an old site map in the transfer packet, Riley said. This garage used to be part of the school auto program. Ethan did not speak. He had known the building had old school bones. Everybody in town knew parts of Falcon Ridge's vocational program had been sold off when funding dried up. But he had never connected the lockers, the layout, the smell of old metal in the back room, to that final year of high school. Maybe he had not wanted to. Some places were easier to survive when you pretended they had no memory. Riley lowered her voice. There was also an email this morning from Mrs. Whitmore to legal. It said, "Make sure locker 17 is cleared before public walkthrough." I thought maybe it was some storage issue. Ethan looked at her carefully. Why are you telling me this? Because she said your son was watching when she called you that name. Riley's face tightened, and because my father was a mechanic. Men like Lena always knew what his hands were worth right up until they had to shake them in public. Before Ethan could answer, a weathered blue sedan turned into the lot and stopped near the office. An old man stepped out slowly, using the roof for balance. He was tall but bent by age, with white hair under a faded Falcon Ridge cap and hands that still looked strong despite the tremor in his fingers. Ethan recognized him before the man reached the bay. Mr. Harlan Price had taught auto shop at Falcon Ridge High for 31 years. He had been the only adult who looked uncertain when everyone else decided Ethan was guilty. Ethan, Harlan said. The name landed differently from Lena's mouth. Not a weapon, a door. Ethan wiped his hands again, though they were already clean. Mr. Price, Harlan looked around the garage. Taking in the sign, the lift, the lockers, the back wall, his eyes stopped on the chip number 17, and something like grief moved through his face. I saw Whitmore's announcement online, he said. Then I saw the background in one of the photos. I didn't know they never removed those. Riley stiffened. You know the lockers? Harlan nodded slowly. Every student in the advanced auto program had one. That row was moved here from the school shop when the building closed. Ethan felt the past step closer. Who had number 17? Harlan looked at him. You did. The garage seemed to shrink around the sentence. Ethan heard the buzz of the fluorescent light, the distant traffic, a wrench settling on a metal shelf somewhere behind him. He looked at locker 17 as if it had become a living thing. That's not possible, he said, though he knew it was. My locker was emptied after the hearing. No, Harlan said quietly. The office said it was emptied. I was never allowed to verify it. Riley opened her folder without being asked. Ms. Whitmore's team is coming tomorrow with security. If there's something inside, she may remove it before you can document it. Ethan stared at the lock. The old rule inside him said, wait, call legal, build proof first. But another rule answered, if someone powerful was on the way to clear evidence, waiting could become surrender. He turned to Paul, who was still beside his truck with the compliance form in his hand. Can the city witness a preservation opening? Paul frowned. I can witness condition and possession. I cannot decide ownership. I'm not asking you to decide ownership, Ethan said. I'm asking you to log that nothing is removed without record. Paul studied the locker, then Lena's notice. Then the boy's toy car sitting on the office counter. I can call the clerk and request a temporary evidence hold pending review. It won't settle the property issue, but it will make removal without documentation a problem for everyone. Good, Ethan said. No one touches anything until that call is logged. Paul stepped outside, made the call, and returned 15 minutes later with a case number written on the back of his inspection sheet. It was not a court order. It was not victory, but it was enough to stop the truth from vanishing quietly. Ethan turned to Riley. If we open it, you record from the bay entrance. Not close enough to touch anything. Mr. Price, you witness Paul. You log time and condition. I photograph before every step. Harlan nodded. Good. No shortcuts. No, came through the front door just after 3. Dropped off by the same neighbor from school. He froze when he saw everyone gathered around the back wall. Dad? Ethan looked at his son and suddenly wished he had done this before Noah arrived. But the boy was part of the truth now, because Lena had made him part of the humiliation. Stay by the office, Ethan said. You can watch from there. Noah held the blue toy car against his chest and nodded. Ethan photographed the lock one final time. Then Harlan reached into his coat pocket and took out a small ring of old keys. When the program closed, I kept some of these, he said. I don't know why. Maybe teachers are just bad at letting go. He tried the first key, nothing. The second slid halfway in and stopped. The third turned with a dry click that made everyone in the garage hold their breath. The sound was small, almost delicate, but it moved through the room like a hammer. Ethan lifted the lock away and set it on a clean shop towel. He photographed it. Then he placed his hand on the locker handle. "Ready?" Paul asked. Ethan did not answer. His eyes moved to Noah, who stood perfectly still with Emily's toy car in his hands. Then Ethan opened locker 17, dust breathed out first. Inside were things wrapped in brown paper, a cracked plastic parts tray, a rolled photograph, a sealed envelope yellowed at the edges, and a black composition notebook swollen from years of heat and cold. Ethan did not grab. He lifted each item carefully, placing it on the workbench while Riley recorded, and Harlan whispered dates under his breath like a man praying backward through time. The rolled photograph came open with a soft curl. It showed a 17-year-old Ethan standing beside a low, unfinished race car body in primer gray, with a faded blue stripe taped along the side. His hair was longer then. His smile was shy, proud, almost disbelieving. Behind him, painted on a shop banner, were the words Falcon Ridge Auto Program. On the nose of the unfinished car was a hand-lettered mark. For 17, Noah stepped closer despite himself. "Dad," he whispered, "is that you?" Ethan could not answer. Harlan picked up the black notebook with both hands, opened to the first page, and then stopped. His mouth pressed into a thin line. The garage went so quiet, even Riley lowered the tablet a little. At the top of the page, in blue ink faded but unmistakable, someone had written, "Falcon Ridge 17 Endurance Prototype Build Log." Under it were columns for date, task, materials, and student lead. Harlan turned one page, then another, until he found the line that made his hand tremble. He read it aloud, and the words seemed to pull 22 years of dirt out of the air. "Lead fabrication," he said, voice breaking. "Ethan Cole." Harlan Price read the words a second time because nobody moved after the first. "Lead fabrication, Ethan Cole." The old teacher's voice was softer now, and that made the sentence heavier. Ethan stood beside the workbench with one hand on the edge of the black notebook, not touching the page, just close enough to feel 22 years pressing up through the paper. He remembered being 17 and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. Hungry to build something good enough that people would have to stop seeing the oil on his clothes before they saw his mind. Hungry to leave Falcon Ridge without leaving his name behind like a stain. That notebook had once been his proof. Then, one Monday morning before the regional submission, it disappeared. And by the end of the week, the whole school was saying Ethan Cole had stolen drawings, faked hours, and ruined the only car the program had ever built. Noah stepped closer, his blue toy car held against his chest. "Dad," he asked quietly, "why did they say you didn't build it?" Ethan looked at the photograph of his younger self beside the unfinished Frel 17. He had imagined telling Noah this story someday. Maybe when the boy was older, maybe when it would sound like old pain instead of a wound still bleeding. But Lena had dragged the past into the garage in front of his son, and now the truth had come with it. "Because someone needed me to disappear from the story," Ethan said. Riley Shaw kept recording, but her hand shook enough that the image on her tablet trembled. Paul Danner, the city inspector, took off his glasses and wiped them even though they were clean. Harlan turned another page in the logbook. Each line was ordinary and devastating. Tubing cut, front bracket corrected. Cooling channel relocated, nose section riveted, fuel cell mount inspected. Next to most entries were initials. EC, sometimes HP, sometimes two other student names Ethan had not spoken in years. The work was not glamorous. It was measurement, correction, late nights, mistakes, and hands learning what pride felt like when it became useful. It was the kind of truth no rumor could build. Then Harlan reached for the yellowed envelope. He paused before opening it, looked at Ethan, and said, "We document before we disturb." Ethan almost smiled because that sounded exactly like the teacher he remembered. Riley photographed the envelope from both sides. Paul wrote the time on his inspection sheet and repeated the temporary evidence hold number into his phone camera. Harlan slit the top carefully with a pocket knife and slid out a folded carbon copy. A small brass key tagged Annex B, and a compact videotape sealed inside a brittle plastic case. The tape looked old but dry, protected by the envelope and the metal locker that had kept most of the weather out. On the cracked white label, in block letters, someone had written, "Shop Office, May 14, 2004. The date made Harlan close his eyes. That was the night before the scholarship file vanished, he said. Ethan stared at the tape. He did not reach for it. Old instinct told him not to hope too quickly. Hope had been the first thing they took from him years ago, and he had spent too long learning to live without asking for it back. "Do we have a way to play it?" he asked. Riley looked up. "There's an old repair place 2 blocks from City Hall. My uncle uses them for court transfers. They can digitize tapes while someone watches the chain of custody." Ethan looked at Paul. "Can you witness that?" Paul hesitated only a second. "If this connects to a development complaint and a property inspection, yes, the clerk already logged the evidence hold. I can witness transport, but I am not taking possession unless the city formally accepts it." "Then we do it properly," Ethan said. "No one leaves alone with anything." The brass key drew Noah's eyes. The tag read Annex B in faded ink. Harlan noticed it too and turned toward the back of the garage, where an old service door stood behind a stack of tires. For years, Ethan had assumed the door led to a shallow storage room that belonged to the landlord. It had been blocked when he moved in, and the previous owner had told him not to bother because the old annex was empty and unsafe. Now, with the key lying on the workbench, the back wall no longer looked like a wall. It looked like a sentence waiting for its last word. They moved slowly. Ethan photographed the service door. The lock, the frame, the dust on the floor, even the cobwebs connecting the lower hinge to the concrete. Harlan stood behind him with the logbook held in a plastic sleeve from Ethan's office drawer. Riley recorded. Paul called the city clerk again and put the phone on speaker while he read the date, time, case number, and names of everyone present. Noah waited by the office door. But his eyes never left his father. The key turned on the first try. At first, the annex gave them only darkness and the dry smell of old wood, rubber, and metal. Ethan lifted the flashlight. The beam caught tarps, stacked crates, a cracked school banner, and then something low and wide beneath a gray canvas cover. He knew before the whole shape appeared. He knew from the height of the nose, from the angle of the side rail under the tarp, from a memory his hands had kept, even when his mind tried to bury it. Harlan whispered, "My God." Ethan pulled the tarp back only far enough to see the front quarter. Dust rolled off in pale waves. Under it sat a primer gray body with a faded blue stripe, unfinished, scarred, and beautiful in the way unfinished honest things can be beautiful. The Falcon-Ridged From 17 had not become the polished student racing triumph the newspaper promised in 2004. It had not vanished either. It had waited in the dark with the same stubborn patience as the truth. Ethan crouched near the nose, aimed the light at the inner frame, and there it was, a hand-stamped plate fixed to a bracket he remembered drilling himself. Fra 17 Falcon Ridge Auto Program E. Co-lead fabrication. The garage went silent for the second time that day. But this silence was different. The first had been shock. This one was recognition. Noah walked in slowly. Forgetting he had been told to stay back, he looked from the plate to the old photograph, then to Ethan's hands. "You built this?" he asked. Ethan swallowed part of it. Harlan's voice cracked. "The hardest part." Riley lowered the tablet. "Ms. Whitmore knows this is here." Ethan looked at the covered car, then toward the open garage bay where late afternoon light stretched across the floor. "No," he said. "She knows something is here, that's why she's afraid. But she does to know we opened it with witnesses." Lena Whitmore arrived 40 minutes later with 2 security men. A lawyer, and the kind of anger that tries to look like procedure. She did not enter the annex at first. She stood in the bay, saw the open locker, saw Riley holding her tablet, saw Paul Danner with his clipboard, and her face changed in small pieces, surprise first, then calculation, then contempt, because contempt was the only mask she trusted. "This site is under development control," she said. "You had no authority to break into sealed property." Ethan stepped out of the annex, wiping dust from his hands with a clean rag. "Then put that in writing," he said. "Include the reason you ordered Locker 17 cleared before tomorrow's investor walkthrough." Lena's eyes snapped toward Riley. Riley did not look away. The lawyer beside Lena lifted his folder. Mr. Cole, any materials recovered from former Falcon Ridge high facilities may constitute school or municipal property. If you remove, conceal, copy, or exploit them, you expose yourself to criminal and civil liability. Ethan nodded once, almost politely. Good. Then we all agree nothing should disappear. City witness is here. Former program instructor is here. Your employee recorded discovery. The clerk has logged a temporary evidence hold. If you want to secure it, we can do that with written chain of custody and neutral storage. Lena stepped closer. You always were good at sounding innocent. Noah flinched at the old poison in her voice. This time Ethan saw it and did not let the moment pass. Don't talk to me like that in front of my son for a second. The garage seemed to hold its breath. Lena looked at Noah, and something cruel almost came out of her mouth. Maybe she saw the cameras. Maybe she saw Riley. Maybe she saw that the boy's eyes were not frightened anymore. Only watching, she turned back to Ethan. Tomorrow morning, she said, my investors will walk this site. If you want to humiliate yourself with high school memories and a pile of scrap, bring them. But understand this, nostalgia does not stop development. No, Ethan said. Evidence does. The next 20 hours moved like a storm held together by paperwork. Riley sent a copy of Lena's email to her own personal account and then, after pacing outside the garage for 10 minutes, forwarded it to Whitmore Auto Group's board compliance address. Paul updated the evidence hold with the city clerk and confirmed that demolition could not proceed until the logged materials were reviewed. Harlan called the Falcon Ridge Alumni Foundation and left 3 messages before someone finally understood what FRE 17 meant. Ethan took the videotape, sealed in a dated evidence bag. To the AV repair shop with Paul and Riley present, he did not watch it there. He stood behind the technician with his arms folded, looking at the blank wall. Because a man could face an engine that might explode and still not be ready for the moment his stolen life came back in color. At 9:12 that night, the technician completed the transfer and played the first 2 minutes in front of everyone. The footage was grainy, angled from the corner of the old shop office, probably from the school's old security camera feed that Harlan once used to monitor tools after hours. The sound cracked and dipped. But the faces were clear enough. Young Lena Whitmore entered with her father. She was 18, polished even then, wearing a Falcon Ridge jacket and the expression of someone who had never believed doors were meant to stay locked. Her father carried a folder. They argued in low voices. Then Lena opened a filing cabinet, removed a submission packet, and replaced it with another one. Her father said, "The Cole boy will deny it." Lena answered, "Who are they going to believe?" No one in the AV shop spoke after that. The technician looked at Ethan with a sadness that felt almost like an apology from the whole town. Ethan only asked for 3 copies and a signed transfer receipt. By morning, Cole Auto Works looked less like a dying garage and more like a courtroom built out of concrete and oil stains. Lena arrived with investors, city representatives, 2 board members from Whitmore Auto Group, and a polished smile prepared for cameras. She had expected disorder. She found numbered evidence bags. Printed photos, Harlan Price in a suit that did not quite fit anymore, Paul Danner with official inspection notes, Riley standing apart from the Whitmore team, and Ethan beside the covered FRE 17. Noah sat near the office with the blue toy car in his lap. He looked nervous, but he did not look ashamed. Lena began before anyone else could. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why Whitmore Auto Group is committed to responsible redevelopment. Old sites gather old stories. Not all of them are true, and not all of them should obstruct progress. Mr. Cole has attempted to turn a routine property transition into a personal grievance from high school. My team is here to show that this structure is unsafe, outdated, and unsuitable for the future Falcon Ridge deserves." Ethan listened without moving. When she finished, he did not answer with a speech. He walked to the workbench and placed the logbook under the overhead light. "This is the original FRE 17 build log recovered from Locker 17 yesterday at 3:42 p.m. in the presence of a city inspector, a former program instructor, and a Whitmore employee." He placed the photograph beside it. "This is me at 17 standing beside the same car." He nodded to Harlan, who pulled back the tarp. "And this is the car." The unfinished FRE 17 seemed smaller in daylight and somehow more powerful. Investors leaned forward. One of the board members removed her glasses. Harlan pointed to the plate but did not touch it. "Falcon Ridge Auto Program. E. Cole Lead Fabrication. The plate matches the logbook and the photograph. I supervised this build." Ethan Cole did the work. Lena crossed her arms. A sentimental artifact does not prove the allegation that made him ineligible. No, Ethan said. The tape does. The sentence changed the room before the footage even played. Lena's face lost its color so quickly that one of her lawyers turned toward her. Riley connected the drive to a monitor borrowed from the Av shop. The screen flickered. The old shop office appeared. The younger Lena walked into frame with her father. The folder changed hands. The filing cabinet opened. The submission packet disappeared. Then the sentence came through the speakers. Thin with age but clear enough to cut every defense in half. Who are they going to believe? The room went silent. Not the small silence of people waiting for more. Not the awkward silence after an insult. This was the final silence, the one that arrives when everyone understands that a powerful person has been standing on someone else's life and calling it a floor. Lena did not move. Her investors did not look at her. The board members did. One of them, a gray-haired man named Thomas Vale, turned to Riley. Did Whitmore instruct your team to clear Locker 17 before this walkthrough? Riley's voice shook, but it held. Yes, I forwarded the email to board compliance last night. Lena finally spoke. That email was about site safety. Ethan looked at the locker, then at the car, then at the monitor still frozen on her younger face. No, he said. It was about fear. A man from the Falcon Ridge Alumni Foundation arrived halfway through the silence, out of breath, carrying a leather folder and a magnifying glass he never needed to use. His name was Dr. Marcus Lane, historian for the Foundation's Vocational Archive. He examined the logbook, the plate, the photograph, the carbon copy of the scholarship submission, the case number from the evidence hold, and the signed transfer receipt from the AV shop. He asked Harlan 3 questions. Checked the dates against foundation records on his tablet, and then looked around the garage. This is not merely a student vehicle, he said. This is the missing Frau 17 project file. The record shows Ethan Cole was disqualified for falsified submissions. Based on what I see here, that record was wrong. Noah stood so quickly, his chair scraped the floor. Everyone looked at him. The boy's face was red, but he did not sit back down. So my dad didn't cheat, he asked. Dr. Lane looked at Ethan first, then at Noah. No, he said, your father built something people were not honest enough to protect. Ethan looked down because the room had blurred. For years, he had told himself he did not need Falcon Ridge to say it was sorry. He had built a life out of what remained. He had loved Emily. He had raised Noah. He had fixed cars for people who needed one more month from engines other shops gave up on. But hearing the truth said aloud in front of his son reached a place pride had never touched. The consequences did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like locked doors opening one after another. Whitmore Auto Group's board suspended Lena from all development authority pending investigation. The investors withdrew from the showroom project before lunch, and Thomas Vale announced that no board promotion or chairwoman vote would move forward while the FRA 17 matter remained under review. The city froze demolition until ownership, historical status, and prior school property transfers could be examined. Paul Danner closed the hazardous complaint as unsupported. Dr. Lane drafted a public correction for the Foundation archive and requested emergency preservation status for the FAR 17 and the garage annex. Lena stood beside her SUV while her lawyers spoke in urgent whispers. She looked smaller outside the garage, as if the building she had called worthless had taken back the size she borrowed from it. Ethan walked out only because she asked for him. For a moment they stood facing each other on the cracked asphalt where she had humiliated him 2 days earlier. You could ruin me, she said. Ethan studied her face. The old Lena would have made that sound like an accusation. The CEO Lena tried to make it sound like negotiation. But under both, for the first time, he heard fear. No, he said. You did that part yourself. Her eyes hardened. What do you want? Ethan looked back through the open bay door. Noah was standing near the FREF 17, listening to Harlan explain something about the frame with his hands instead of too many words. Riley was helping Paul label the evidence bags. Dr. Lane was photographing the plate. The garage was not quiet anymore. It was alive in a way Ethan had not felt since Emily used to sit by the office window and wave at customers like the place had a future. I want the record corrected, Ethan said. I want your company to stop the complaint against my license. I want the city to know this demolition order was pushed with concealed evidence. And I want you to stay away from my son. Lena waited, maybe expecting him to ask for money first. When he did not, something like confusion moved across her face. "That is it, no," Ethan said. "I want every kid who gets called what you called me to have a place where the work speaks louder." 3 weeks later, the sign above the bay still needed paint. The floor still had cracks. The old office still smelled faintly of coffee and oil, but Cole Auto Works no longer felt like a place waiting to be erased. A temporary banner hung beside the old sign, Falcon Ridge Youth Automotive Restoration Program. Opening soon, the Alumni Foundation released a public correction that restored Ethan's name to the FRA 17 archive and acknowledged that the 2004 scholarship disqualification had been based on falsified records. The statement did not give Ethan back 22 years, but it gave Noah something clean to carry into school on Monday. The Alumni Foundation and a private collector had signed a preservation agreement that kept the FRA 17 on site. Ethan would be paid as restoration lead and instructor, not as a charity case, not as a symbol, but as the man who knew the car because his hands had helped build it. The collector put $750,000 into a restricted fund for the car, the garage, and student scholarships. Harlan said it was more money than the old program had seen in 20 years, then pretended his eyes were watering because of dust. Riley left Whitmore Auto Group and accepted a job helping the foundation manage the new program. Paul brought his nephew by on Saturday to ask about SAIC engine classes. The local paper printed a correction with Ethan's name in the headline, though he folded it and put it in a drawer instead of framing it. Some victories were not meant to hang on walls. Some were meant to change the air your child breathed. On the first Saturday after the announcement, Noah arrived early with his backpack and Emily's blue toy race car. Ethan was in the annex, standing beside the FRA 17, with a clipboard and a parts list. He had not restored it. Not yet. The car remained dusty, unfinished, and honest. That was the point. Collectors were not paying for polish. They were protecting provenance. Students would learn on it slowly, properly, with every step documented and every hand named, because Ethan knew what happened when work became invisible. Noah placed the toy car on the workbench beside the old FRA 17 plate, then looked up at his father. "Dad, yeah. When people at school ask what happened, what should I say?" Ethan set the clipboard down. He thought about giving a careful answer, something humble, something that would not sound like revenge. Then he looked at the blue toy car, the one Emily had bought because she believed chipped things could still carry joy, and he remembered her words. "Old places remember what people try to bury. Tell them the truth came out," he said. Noah nodded, but he did not leave. "Were you scared?" Ethan laughed once softly every day, "But you still opened the locker." Ethan looked toward locker 17, now cleaned but not repainted. The number remained visible on purpose. "No," he said. "We opened it. You were here too." Noah smiled a little at that. Then he stepped closer and wrapped both arms around his father's waist. Ethan held him with one hand and rested the other on the dusty body of the FRA 17 for 22 years. He had thought the car was the thing they stole from him. Now he understood it differently. They had stolen credit, time, scholarship letters, and the easy version of his name. But they had not stolen the work. They had not stolen the patience. They had not stolen the kind of father he became after loss, after shame, after every locked door, outside. Sunlight crossed the cracked parking lot and touched the old sign above the bay. Cole Auto Works still looked rough from the road. The paint was still faded. The roof still needed repair. A person driving too fast might still call it worthless. But inside, a boy placed his mother's toy car beside a forgotten prototype. An old teacher wrote Ethan's name correctly on the first student lesson plan. And a single dad who had spent half his life being misnamed finally stood in a garage that remembered him.